I'm not a college president, thank God. But part of the things I would talk to them about as they plan for the fall, right, is remember to set conduct rules, enforce them consistently, communicate them constantly, right? Part of the challenge here is communicating those rules through multiple media, multiple messengers, practical things like no masks, things like, keep outsiders outside. Now, that's a lot easier to say at a private institution than a public institution. Understand and differentiate between violence and civil disobedience. And then lastly is, and I want to make sure that the nuance is captured here, right, is to the extent possible, engage in good faith, especially with students who are, when it comes to the students, right, a lot of them are coming because they're seeing a moral issue that they want to engage in deeply, right? Now, the good faith portion is really important as well, right? Because if the goalpost keeps getting moved, that's not good faith.
And now, The Good Fight with Yascha Mounk.
My guest today is Raj Vinnakota. Raj is the president of the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, where, among other interesting initiatives, he heads up the College Presidents for Civic Preparedness. So he has really been in the middle of the work to try and think about how American universities can do better at actually teaching students the basic civic values that we need in order to sustain our democracy, how we can make sure that they come out of college knowing the basic facts about the Constitution and hopefully caring about its values. We talked about how we can create a culture on campus in which students actually listen to each other across political differences rather than bully each other into mouthing the same political slogans, and the extent to which this kind of work can actually help universities weather the storms that we've seen in such an extreme way on campus in the last weeks and months, and more broadly, become good citizens. This conversation is part of a broader series about the future of education and how we can overcome its identitarian drift, sponsored by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations. Raj Vinnakota, welcome to the podcast.
It's an honor to be here, Yascha. Thank you.
Well, I really look forward to our conversation. Raj, you've been leading an organization that, among other things, works with college presidents to help them think through how they can ensure that students at their colleges and universities actually learn to be good citizens, that they get good civic education and do all the other things that are necessary for them to really engage with the world in a productive way. I imagine it's been a busy few months.
It has been a busy few years, Yascha. I'm a scientist by training. I'm actually a molecular biologist by my bachelor's. So I look at this from a science perspective as well, and seeing all of the inputs and, really wanting to capture the data about what we're learning here, to me, really piques my curiosity.
So tell us a little bit about what the gap at universities was before everything exploded that you were trying to address. And then perhaps we can go on to talk about how that manifested now in this situation of high tension on campus. But how are universities doing at actually trying to mold good citizens, at trying to ensure that students come out with a real understanding of what the American Constitution is, what the basic values of liberal democracy are, that they're civically engaged? What before this moment of crisis was kind of the gap that you identified to start your work?
Our work around civic preparation actually started here at this organization when I became president in July of 2019. And I brought this broader notion that we needed to reprioritize citizen development, civic preparation as a societal responsibility. And I started to have conversations with college presidents, Yascha, and they kept telling me over and over again that higher ed, frankly, had lost its way, that the pendulum had swung way too far in it being viewed as a private good and that higher education has a public good set of responsibilities around developing citizens, about how it engages in our democracy. And so that was incredibly important. And we saw that over and over again in the conversations we had with presidents. At the same time, at CNS, we've done a series of surveys of 18 to 24-year-olds. We came out with a major one in September of last year that showed real deficiencies when it came to civic knowledge, whether or not our population was well informed, in regards to whether or not they were engaged in and being productive in their communities, and also, and this is the third part of how we define a citizen, in their commitment to democracy in America. So we were worried that across all three of those areas, we were seeing deficiencies.
So tell me a little bit about that survey. What is the great quiz show in BoJack Horseman? Hollywood celebs, what do we know, what don't we know, and something else. So what is it that college students know and what is it that they don't know?
So this was called the Youth Civic Outlook Report. It came out in September. And I want to be clear, it was 18 to 24-year-olds writ large. So it included college students.
But it went beyond college students, yeah.
Yeah, it went beyond college students. What we saw was significant deficiencies around civic knowledge, that we had 82% of young people that age who were not civically well-informed.
And give me some examples of that, right? I mean, if you're saying we don't have civic knowledge, what's a question that perhaps most listeners, would expect young Americans to know that they didn't know the answer to, or that they got the answer too wrong?
Yeah, so two questions. One is, who breaks a tie in the Senate? A question to understand government structures. And then another one is, what political party is in power in the House, in the Senate, and in the presidency? So it's part the structures and part about understanding kind of who's in charge and who's leading the work right now.
The question about who breaks the tie in the Senate doesn't shock me as much. That seems, if you're really interested in politics, you should certainly know that. But, I don't know that the average 20-year-old needs to really know that in order to be, thoughtful about politics. The questions about who's in charge in the House and the Senate and the White House seem more worrying. Was that majorities of respondents who didn't know the answer to that question, or there was just 1 in 5 people who didn't know the answer?
So it depends on the question, but by and large, less than 75% knew the answer to any of those questions. In the more difficult questions, right, it was less than 50%.
So we were talking about what do they know. Now let's talk about what do they think and what don't they think. So when it comes to the state, the sort of democratic values, and this is obviously something that my colleague Roberto Infor and I have been working on for a long time. And at the time in 2014, we made the argument that people in general are starting to give less importance to democracy than they once did. They're more open to authoritarian alternatives to democracy, including extreme ones like army rule. And that this is by no means, sometimes people misunderstood our argument, exclusive to the youth, but it is more pronounced among young people, including more pronounced among young people than it would have been among young people 25 or 30 years ago. We've since had attempts to replicate that data across a broader set of countries. The Open Society Foundation had a big study internationally asking some of the same questions, and they have confirmed our interpretation of the data at the time, that this is a very significant problem and it has grown over time. So what is it that you found specifically among American young people on some of these questions?
We looked at a couple of different things. We didn't look at much over time, but what we did look at and ask questions were, when you think of democracy, what are the core pieces that are really important to you? And what you saw was a greater focus around values. When people think about democracy, it's about fairness, equality, or specific aspects of how you think about democracy in kind of a operational sense. So there was a clear differentiation there. I will say one of the things, Yascha, when you think about different generations and how they think about this issue, one of the things that was actually very positive for us is actually that we saw that young people actually were more willing to engage in difficult conversations than the general population, actually 2x. So roughly speaking, 40% versus 20% in terms of the general population and being comfortable with engaging in those conversations. So that's one of the ways that we started to think about, okay, how can we engage in these issues? And even at a young age, right before the 18-year-olds, and think about K-12 and other mechanisms to ensure that young people are civically well-informed.
And there's now been a lot of research on similar and related questions. And I think the findings, as you're presenting them, seem to me to be broadly in line with what my read of the literature is, which is to say that most citizens of democratic countries, including in the United States and including young people, like democracy. They certainly wouldn't say that they're against democracy in the starkest way, but they prioritize put nicely, their substantive policy goals, or put less nicely, their partisan political interests over the maintenance of democratic norms. So both from various polling questions, from various, experiments in social psychology, and just from observing how voters actually act, you can see that, in the abstract, of course, they think democratic norms and institutions are very important. But when these clash with their particular policy goals, they have two ways of getting around that constraint. The first is to say, well, this policy goal is so important that it is fine to violate this long-standing democratic norm in order to pursue it. It should just be a priority. That is sort of a biting the bullet in philosophical language. And the second is the obfuscating arm. It's to say that when we're doing it for this purpose, that is not against the democratic norm. But, obviously, if the opposition did it for their purposes, that would be a shocking breach of democratic norms. And that's roughly how I see sort of what not all citizens, but a majority of citizens in most democratic countries feel right now. And that's why it's so hard to protect against attacks on democracy. And so part of that is trying to teach people the importance of those norms and understanding that those norms exist and understanding of how the system works. Of course, the worry is that in some of those polls, it doesn't look like people who know more about those institutions, know more about those norms, necessarily become less likely to prioritize the partisan interests. They may simply have more vocabulary and more excuses to explain their rule breaking away. So what's the theory of action here, right? How is it that you want to take these young people, particularly on college campuses in your case, but perhaps more broadly, give them civic knowledge? How do you think that is going to improve political outcomes or shore up our democracy?
So let me come at this both philosophically and practically. Philosophically, I actually think one of our superpowers at Citizens and Scholars is that we're able to build and hold people in community, because that's what you have to recognize, right? What we have is interlocking concentric circles of community. People with very different perspectives and views engaging together. And that's actually one of the things we do, right? When we, at some point we'll talk about our college presidents, right? We started with 15 last August. We're at 65 and growing at this point. And they also have a diverse set of perspectives and views, but holding them in community and similarly holding our nation in community and saying, look, we're all in this boat together, right? We actually have to figure out how we work together on these issues is really, really important. So I just want to give that philosophical overview because I may come back to it a few times. On a practical level, our presidents, we developed a set of civic commitments that everyone has to champion, right? That is kind of the entry point to being part of our work, which is called College Presidents for Civic Preparedness. And at its core, those commitments are really about affirming a flourishing, diverse, truth-seeking community that is working together so that you develop young people who are citizens who can engage in self-government, right? So how do you go about doing that? There are actually many different ways, but you have to affirm that that's the North Star. That is where you want to get to. And embedded in that is that we're actually all in that same boat and we have to work on it. And that we don't necessarily know the exact right way to go, right? Many people talk about America being an experiment. In similar ways, each of our institutions is experimenting with this to try to figure out what's the best way to actually go forward. To me, that's actually one of the beauties of the work that we're doing. We have 65 institutions, and we're growing fast, who all are trying to figure out how do we hold these ourselves in community that is actually flourishing, diverse, and truth-seeking. I mentioned the joy of working with such a diverse group. Part of what we've been doing very deliberately from the beginning is wanting to make sure that the group of college president institutions we work with includes large state universities, regional state universities, small elite liberal arts schools, AAU institutions, ideologically very different campuses as well as presidents, right? I mean, the list includes, you've got, Wesleyan and Wellesley to, Dartmouth and Cornell to Rutgers and Minnesota and Wisconsin to Claremont McKenna College to Rollins College, Sewanee and Johns Hopkins, Georgetown, and institutions like that. It's really important for us to be able to have that diversity, both from a learning perspective, but also because it doesn't immediately categorize as, it's those kinds of schools. We actually really want to be learning from each other. And we just got our first community college presidents to join us as well.
Let's speak about community for a moment, and I want to come back to the college presidents. There's two kinds of communities, right? There's communities in which people have very diverse views, but because the members of the community know each other and trust each other, they are able to look past those views or perhaps even have genuine conversations about which of those views is correct in a way that is open-minded and might lead some people to change their own stance, right? But there's also communities that enforce a form of homogeneity. And we see from experiments by Cass Sunstein and others that often communities where the most members have a view that skews in one direction actually radicalize, right? So, what he's shown is that when juries deliberate on what kind of damages to give, the victim of a car that was faulty and they're trying to give damages against the car company, often they might come in individually saying it should be 500,000 to $1 million. And after they deliberate together among people who all thought this is bad and the car company is at fault, they end up with 4 or 5 million, right? The product of a collective deliberation ends up being more extreme than the product of the individual attitudes going in. And that's true not only in this context where you might have some sympathy for why shouldn't the poor victim get a lot of money from this big car company, but when it comes to criminal punishments, when it comes to all kinds of other things, when it comes to abortion policy, people radicalize in this kind of way in groups. And I worry that this is particularly true in parts of the American elite in New England, where a lot of colleges are located, and particularly in those elite colleges. So, when I speak to Europeans, they often think that America continues to be Puritan in significant ways. And where they locate that in America is usually sort of in the Bible Belt. You have all these like very, very religious people who put these restrictions on how to live, and they shame their children if they want to have a romantic partner or something like that. And I think that's really a wrong model of America. I mean, there's some of that, but to me, the most Puritan part of America in many ways is precisely the places where the Puritans have historically been the strongest. They have changed the set of views that you expected to hold, right? So nobody, or very few people at Harvard think you shouldn't have sex before marriage, or, the nature of their views has changed radically to the views of the people who founded those institutions. But the nature of moral imaginary, of how community works, is still remarkably similar in my mind. And part of that is, if you somehow place yourself outside the community, through action or word, if you somehow go outside the acceptable bounds of what you're supposed to say and think, then we need to purify the community because you're a danger to it, you're a pollutant. I don't think that's how Catholic cultures think, right? I don't think it's how many other kinds of culture thinks. I think that is actually a Puritan inheritance, even though there's no Puritans left at these institutions. So that's sort of one of my theories of the case. And so then the question becomes, all right, so you do have college campuses where you have people genuinely of great ethnic and geographic diversity, to some extent of real political diversity. There certainly are students of a broad range of views at all of these institutions. But because the predominant set of views among students, among faculty members, and perhaps especially among administrators skews very clearly in one direction, I don't know that they are very good at the moment at creating those communities where people feel empowered to have genuine conversations in exchange. And so is the community aspect a boon or a problem? And how can we turn it from being, in many cases, a problem into something that is actually a boon?
So I'm going to set aside as much of the New England piece as possible. As someone who now lives in a town of 8,000 people in Maine, we could have that conversation for the rest of this time as well.
I'm fascinated by small towns in New England. So, talk to me about your small town in Maine as much as you like.
So one of the reasons that I love living up here is because there is an ethic of communitarianism, right? And that, kind of the Bob Putnam social capital, how do you engage? Everyone works together is a kind of a fundamental worldview when I look around, even in a region that clearly is not of one political ilk or one ideological ilk. And especially when you have one elementary school, one middle school, one high school, 2 grocery stores, you're going to see everyone everywhere, right? And I think that actually helps create some bounds in how you talk about each other and how you work together, because you're in community and you're not leaving. So you do actually need to work towards solutions, right? So that would be what I would call maybe an optimistic, productive way of thinking about this and working through it. But let me actually also now talk about kind of how I see this kind of happening on college campuses. Yascha, one of the most exciting pieces of our work is that in the late fall, a number of our college presidents came to us and said, Raj, we've been working with you now for a few years, quietly and then publicly, around how do we bring the knowledge, skills, dispositions of civic preparation on our campus. But it seems to us that this may be a moment to actually really leap forward in the way in which we think about civil discourse on our campuses. And we started having a series of conversations and said, what if we decided to take on an audacious goal, which was, how do we bring both the teaching, the education of civil discourse, constructive dialogue, community problem solving, and then the practice of it to our campuses, not as an opt-in, not as a single faculty member, not as a debate in front of you, but rather as a campus-wide approach so that every single student develops these skills and graduates with them. That's an audacious undertaking, because when you looked around, we didn't see any institution doing it at that level. They're almost always opt-in, Yascha. And so for us, I was like, this sounds great. So we started working with those three presidents. When we shared it with the other portion of our consortium, 18 presidents raised their hand and said, we're in. Let's go do this. Now is the time. And so this project, which we called campus-wide immersion, we're literally developing action plans with these 18 institutions. And it has to be a very broad approach that takes into account orientation, takes into account student life, takes into account academics and curricular, but also co-curricular, extracurricular. What's the leadership role? And how do we do this in a broad enough way? But here's the piece that's most exciting to me. We are also going to go about measuring whether or not we're actually being effective, not only at the intervention level, but at the campus climate level. What are we seeing in terms of affective polarization? What are we seeing in terms of students being comfortable speaking up their points of view? What are we seeing about students being comfortable hearing different points of view? And then every president can decide other measures they want to have as well. But these are ones that we've said we will measure across all of our institutions, not so that we could rank order and, kind of point fingers, but rather so we learn in this journey of what's actually working versus what's not, right? Okay, so you're taking on largely a curricular approach. You're taking on a student life approach, or you're taking on, right? So we're all going to be doing slightly different things, working together in community to see what are we actually learning from this journey together. So I agree with you.
So we'll have to have you come back to give us those results when we're there, but tell us a little bit more about those different buckets that you're exploring right now and what your best guess is at the moment as to what would work. If a university president comes to you and says, hey, I'm in, give me some advice in which direction I should go in. What at this point do you think would be the set of best practices that can actually, let's say, do the following things, right? Increase civic knowledge among students, deepen their commitment to democracy, and perhaps most importantly, create the kind of community in which people can be their authentic selves and have difficult conversations across political divides, as opposed to the kind of community where people, which I know is true of many students at these institutions, having talked to them, feel constrained from what they can say, because if they express a point of view that is in a small way divergent from that of their peers, they're going to get into genuine trouble. And without going into details, I know of a number of contexts in which there's been just vast differences between how people have expressed themselves, even in student government positions, in public votes, and when the same vote was put to them in a private way, right? That is the extent of preference falsification that is currently happening on many college campuses. It's quite stark. So what will we need to do to overcome that? Because, just to say one more word on that, that is a problem not just when it comes to student government, because the outcome of a vote may go a different way from how those representatives of students actually think the outcome should go, which is a travesty of the democratic nature of student government. Is not the most important institution in the world, but insofar as it matters, it is. That doesn't seem good. But it's just, to me, deeply troubling about what it shows more broadly, right? Like how deeply students are used to engaging in preference falsification, to what extent they've internalized that they can't actually tell their peers their genuine opinions without getting into trouble. So I think that should be one of the key goals as well. So how are you thinking about these different buckets, and what at this point, looks like might be the best practices?
Yeah, so from a theory perspective, when we look at our work on campus-wide immersion, we often talk about the fact that the skills development piece is one of three aspects of the work. You have to start actually by creating the motivation to want to do this. And so there has to be the work that says, hey, students, you want to do this because not only is it better for you to be involved in society, but actually it'll help you get good jobs, keep good jobs, right? You have to create kind of an internal reason to do this, both on a societal level, but also, frankly, on a selfish level, right? You then have to develop the skills. And lastly, and this is the reason why I'm going here, Yascha, is you have to create the social permission for it. The good news, as we know from research, is social permission doesn't even have to be a majority. You just have to see one other person or two other people acting the way you want to act, and that really breaks open the floodgates. And so in the cases of where we're talking with our presidents and working with our schools, it's everything from can you get captains of athletic teams, leaders on campuses to come together and say, yes, we will together voice the ways in which we want to be acting, and that way actually be able to be role models for others. It's on the skills side that you start to really think about. You use the word best practices. I want to shy away from that because, frankly, there's been very little measurement in this space, right? And as a scientist, I would say I don't have data yet that tells me what a best practice is, right?
So let's call it best hunches or best guesses.
Best hunches, best hypotheses, right? There are multiple ways of getting at this, and we know that there are 5 or 6 or 7 different projects and programs that are working on this, right? Some of them you've had on this talk, right? Eboo Patel and Interfaith America and the work that they're doing, Manu Mill and Bridge USA, Constructive Dialogue Institute and the work that they're doing. Those are just a few of the examples, Braver Angels and so on, that are doing this work. And I can point to college presidents who are saying, I'm going to take a subset of this work and what we're doing on our college. So, we were talking earlier about Dartmouth and it's Dartmouth Dialogues work and so on, right? There are a number of other places that are doing similar type of projects. And we're going to mix them together and see whether or not this all works together. The good news is because we're starting to use a measurement construct and a case study and how do we learn, we'll start to get some leading indicators probably by the end of the fall on what we're learning, what we're seeing. The other thing, Yascha, I didn't mention earlier is there are many other schools. It's not just these 18, but other presidents who said, I want to be part of that as well. So we're literally thinking about what's the next cohort look like and how do we think about that? So best hunches it's some mix of how do you do this with, pre-orientation work? How do you do this in the student life? And then how do you do this curricularly, but led by students, right? Who are providing the social permission and then kind of implementing all of these skills in different manner.
Where is the binding constraint in implementing some of these ideas? You said that, the college presidents you've been working in are very receptive to these ideas. Of course, that is in a way a selection bias because you are speaking to the college presidents who are most motivated. That's why they're part of your coalition. I feel like I'm lucky enough to have a similar selection bias at the moment because the president of my university, Johns Hopkins, is very thoughtful about these topics, has actually written an excellent book really on this topic, what universities owe democracy. And so Ron Daniels has really been trying to push forward with this at Hopkins, both in the institute, I'm a part of the Agora Institute, but also across the university. So there are clearly some university presidents who really are engaged in this topic, but I imagine there's others that, would come back to you and say, I'm the president of a large public school in the Midwest. I think that all of what you're talking about is just some kind of covert form of political indoctrination. And really what we owe taxpayers is to, turn out engineers and people of other kind of skills. And why on earth should we have them spend time on this kind of stuff, right? I imagine that there's leaders that are reluctant. In the same way, I'm sure that there's many faculty members across the nation that share our view of the importance of civic preparedness, that are willing to engage in it. But there's also others that are going to resist that. And I would say that they probably fall into 3 buckets, right? Like some of them may be in STEM and say, look, all of this humanities and social science stuff is just not very interesting to us and leave us alone with it. A second set of bucket may actually have very different political views. So they may say, you know what, like the basic institutions of liberal democracy are bad and corrupt, And if we talk about democracy at all, it should be to talk about what's wrong with it. And I think that's actually one of my concerns about civic education in general, that it often skips the part where it explains the principles of the system and why they're valuable and what's good about it, and goes straight to the critique. The critique should be part of it. Of course, we want people to engage critically with their institutions and with their country and its history. But if you skip the affirmative part and go straight to the critique, and especially the critique is one that I think is too radical, distorting and exaggerating the facts, and that's taught not as one possible critical perspective that students might take, but as the gospel truth, as a thing you have to agree on in order to get a good grade in the class, and all of that stuff exists in certain cases. That is obviously a source of resistance. And then the third sort of resistance is both more understandable and more knee-jerk, and that is that faculty members hate being told by university administrators what to do, often for good reason, and might oppose even very good initiatives just because they come from some position of authority within a university hierarchy, and say, my college president is coming to me and saying, they're part of this weird coalition that some nonprofit built, and now we're going to come to campus and roll out this program. We don't want any part of that because we don't like the president anyway, and we don't like to be told what to do, and we're just going to say no, right? So where is the resistance? I mean, is it sort of getting more university presidents beyond the selected sample of people who've opted in already to get on board of this? Is it overcoming these kinds of forms of resistance on campus? And I'm sort of armchair philosophizing about what the different attitudes of faculty are. I mean, am I right in my sort of assumptions, or does it look very different actually, sort of where the support is and where the resistance is when you're trying to roll these programs out?
Wow, that's a really broad question, and there was a couple of sub-questions and statements there. So let me kind of parse it, take it apart, and build it back up. Let's talk about when we really started doing the work deeply with our college presidents for civic preparedness, which was last January 2023. And our president said we needed to focus on 3 items as our first 3 major projects. The first is that we needed to reclaim the narrative and the work that we called Campus Call for Free Expression and Critical Thinking, that we needed to make this a priority again. The second thing, which was very connected to this one, Yascha, was our presidents also said we can go only as far as we bring our faculty. And many of our faculty, when they talk to us, want to engage in this work, but frankly don't have the skills to be able to bring contentious issues in a classroom in a productive manner, and need and want the practice to do that, and then to figure out how to be able to work with their peers. So we looked around and tried to find best practice, and ended up actually standing up a faculty institute in August of last year, brought 4 faculty instructors from different institutions who were doing really interesting work. They were coming from Duke, Chicago, American, Columbia, and we had more than 35 faculty members from 18 institutions. And they spent 3 days actually working on what are the tools to do this? How do I practice doing this? How do I build a network, a community of practice to actually try to implement this? And they're now spending this year bringing all that they learned into one of their existing courses or into developing a new course. And we're not only supporting those faculty members, we're also evaluating what's the effectiveness of that work. Our intention is, after we learn whether or not we're actually, there's efficacy to this, what I'll call transfer of knowledge and skills, to then figure out how does this get scaled on campuses. Because the theory here from presidents is actually faculty would like to do this. They just need the support and the space and the time to do that. Related to the Faculty Institute, and this actually speaks to one of your points about kind of where some of the friction might be. To me, one of the most interesting aspects of it was that faculty group was made up, it was really cross-discipline. You had 40% from the humanities, not a surprise, 40% from the social sciences, and 20% from STEM. And so one of the things that we're learning right now as they're starting to implement this is, how do you actually implement this in math, in science courses, right? And you can actually think about it, right, in fairly effective ways. I'll just make it up. We didn't have a math professor, but there's a lot of ways of applying math into thoughtful civil discourse, right? How do you actually look at information? How do you evaluate it? How do you use it in debate, right? How do you use data? So on and so forth. So what we're doing right now is learning how do you go about actually teaching faculty to do this well. And then we'll talk about how do we go about actually scaling this. We're not there yet. And then the third piece of this that our president said is we need to be able to figure out how to measure effectiveness, right? And so I've been talking about this over and over again. I'm sorry, I'm a bit of a broken record, but this is part of the way in which I approach this work. So what I'm hearing from presidents and the people we work with is that if we take kind of an affirmative way of actually working on this and working with faculty, that they actually see a line to be able to make this possible. And right, going back to the campus-wide immersion work, which is the president's on the deep end of the pool, it's necessary but not sufficient. You also need to figure out how you leverage other parts of the community to actually be able to do this so that the whole campus climate changes over time.
Let's address the elephant in the room, which is October 7th, Israel's war in Gaza, and the very deep tensions this has led to on campus. I assume that on the one side, this has woken up many university presidents to not just the importance, but the urgency of doing this kind of work. But I wonder whether it's also in some ways shown certainly the limits of how much you can achieve once this culture has eroded and when you're in a moment of crisis, but perhaps more broadly of how much of a difference it can make in these kinds of moments of really hot tension. I'm trying to decide in my mind between two different hypotheses, right? So hypothesis A is the universities that have done a lot better at giving students civic knowledge, but more importantly of modeling constructive disagreement between students, of creating that kind of healthy community where you can sit with tension, have had better outcomes in the last months, have had fewer students feel that the campus is not safe for them, have had forms of protest that were more likely to conform to basic rules of university and basic laws beyond the university, and have therefore perhaps avoided the kind of showdown between encampments and police being called in that have characterized many campuses, but by no means most or all campuses. The second hypothesis is, look, all that stuff matters a little bit at the margins and at the edges, but what was more important ultimately is different kinds of things. It's the specific composition of a student body, whether there's an elevated number of students on one side of these issues or on both sides of these issues. What matters more is, are you in a major city where there's lots of outside activists who can come in and sort of use the campus as a staging ground in an effective way? Do you have a student body that is just much more inclined towards forms of activism and that perhaps sees challenging authority, including through ways that break the rules, as sort of part of the sort of repertoire of protest and the model of how to push for social change? And if all of those things are true, then perhaps the best civics programs and the best culture you're trying to build on campus is just always going to be overrun by these other factors when push comes to shove. Do you think it's clear that hypothesis 1 is closer to the truth than hypothesis 2? And if so, why?
So the answer is it's too soon to tell, right? Because there's not yet enough, frankly, remove and data to really give us a sense of what's happened and why it's happened. We're still unearthing things every week. Here's what I would argue. There are things that you can do on your campus, many of which we talk about, the commitments that we talk about, that you can sign up for, that can ameliorate the issues that we're seeing. I have no idea what ends up being the spark that ends up setting off a conflagration in one place versus not another. And you have to kind of look at the underlying sets of issues. And that's what's assumed in hypothesis A that we don't yet know enough about. The second thing I would just say about this area is that part of what's gotten very difficult is, especially when you think about holding people in community, is how do we get out of false binaries in the moment, right? Is that what you have is people going to their corners, and the process and the work right now is actually about bringing people back into community. And that's really hard, as you know, right? When you create the either kind of really hard and fast lines where people can't navigate between them, or you kind of pull the bridges, right? Like that actually could go across these chasms. And so for me, so much of the work of the last 6 to 9 months has been to be in support of presidents who want to keep those bridges, right? I get very excited when I see institutions where professors come together and say, it is our responsibility to educate our students on these issues and to role model what we're doing. One of the things that brings me great joy is that we have these presidents. We're a bit of a microcosm, right, in holding community with people of very different views. If you look at the list of our presidents, right, but they are all committing to being part of this community and working and learning from each other, even if they don't necessarily come with the same views, and frankly, are in very different parts of the journey around how do you get to actually championing the civic commitments, right? So they're being honest, vulnerable with us, with each other about where they are, and holding that community for me is one way of trying to set an example of how one can do it. It's not the only way, right? But it's certainly an example, and it's hard. It's really hard.
So I know your organization is very much not in the business of crisis communication and, executive coaching to presidents facing a very difficult job at the moment. But if I can ask you to take off your organizational hat and put on the hat of somebody who thinks about these issues very carefully and critically, what would your advice to university presidents be right now? I mean, if you are facing a deeply divided campus like that, you may agree that the institution has failed in various ways over the last 10 or 20 years to build the kind of culture of civic preparedness that might come in handy right now, but it's too late for that, and perhaps it wasn't your fault. So you can't call on those resources. How do you model these values at a moment of high tension in a way that makes a difference and that doesn't come to look hypocritical because you have neglected those values in the last years? How do you confront these situations in a way that minimizes insofar as possible the likelihood that you just split campus into these completely irreconcilable camps?
So I would answer this on two different levels. One is continue to champion these civic commitments on a philosophical level. But I think part of the question you're also asking, Yascha, is kind of practically, what do you do, right? The way in which I would advise, right, in college, I'm not a college president, thank God. But part of the things I would talk to them about as they plan for the fall, right, is, remember to set conduct rules and force them consistently. Communicate them constantly, right? Part of the challenge here is communicating those rules through multiple media, multiple messengers. It can't just be you, the president, right? That has to happen. Practical things like no masks, things like, keep outsiders outside. Now, that's a lot easier to say at a private institution than a public institution. So I realize that even with that principle, how you go about figuring it, maybe you can leverage time, location, manner, specificities to be able to help you with that. Understand and differentiate between violence and civil disobedience. And then lastly is, and I want to make sure that the nuance is captured here, right, is to the extent possible, engage in good faith. Especially with students who are, when it comes to the students, right, a lot of them are coming because they're seeing a moral issue that they want to engage in deeply, right? Now, the good faith portion is really important as well, right? Because if the goalpost keeps getting moved, that's not good faith. So I want to be clear about that. But it is students, you want to model the civil discourse that you want to see in the constructive dialogue. And so do that as much as possible so that you're modeling the things you want to see from students and administrators and others in your community.
Raj Vinnakota, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Thank you so much for listening to The Good Fight. Lots of listeners have been spreading the word about this show. If you too have been enjoying the podcast, please be like them, rate the show on iTunes, tell your friends all about it, share it on Facebook or Twitter. And finally, please mail suggestions for great guests or comments about the show to goodfightpod@gmail.com. That's goodfightpod@gmail.com.
This recording carries a Creative Commons 4.0 international license. Thanks to Silent Partner for their song, Chess Pieces.